All right, I think we can get going here. So, again, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. We are excited to host this dialogue on Ubuntu applications in the 21st century, critiques, contestations, and convictions. Thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I have a few quick housekeeping items to go over. So we are scheduled for 90 minutes today. And to avoid distractions, we ask that you leave your microphones muted. There will be plenty of opportunity for interaction as you'll see here shortly. I also wanted to note that we do have French interpretation available. The button should be located at the bottom of your screen under the interpretation tab. So if you require, please see the interpretation tab for the French channel. Additionally, questions, as I said, we're going to have a lot of interaction today. So questions can be typed. There will be a Google Doc link that will be shared shortly, as well as the chat here in Zoom for interaction. So I am excited to welcome today our panelist and moderator. We have Dr. Upenyu Maji, who is the inaugural director of the Institute of Ubuntu Thought and Practice here at Michigan State University. I will turn it over to him to introduce the rest of our panelists.
Thank you, Justin, and welcome everyone. We are very excited that you are joining us for this conversation today. I am not going to spend a lot of time introducing our panelists beyond us seeing their faces and their names because we are going to move very quickly into the conversation. So Melissa, thanks for joining us. The next panelist is Femi. I haven't seen Femi yet. I think he's running from another meeting. He'll be joining us shortly. And then we have Dr. Stephen Wanjezi joining us from Uganda. Thank you for being here. And then we have Panache. Panache, thanks for joining us. I see you just popped into the meeting. Then we have Jasper, Dr. Jasper St. Bernard, who is joining us from Tennessee. We are excited again to have you. We also do have Cornelia, who is not listed here, who is joining us to support us with the session today. So let me spend, and I see Femi just joined us. Thank you, Femi. So let me spend just a few moments here. I'm going to share my screen to explain what we are spending our time together doing. It's going to be very, very conversational. And to help us figure out how to spend time together in conversation when maybe it's going to end up being more than 100 people. So let me share my screen, and then we are going to spend a lot of time in this Google Doc. I know that some of us may not be very accustomed to the way we have laid it out, but I want to walk you through what's happening here. So the Google Doc is a couple of tabs that we are going to use during this session, but for right now, I'm here at the introduction page. I want to read you a few kind of sentences that explain the way we designed our day to spend together. And then I'm going to put the link in the chat box, or Cornelia can help us do that. If you are able to come to the link, that would be terrific. If not, we still want to engage with you through the chat box or other ways, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. So when the Alliance for African Partnership, we were discussing this session, we ended up having to explain what this is about. So I want to share with you just this paragraph that we have put together to explain how we are spending our time. The conversation on critiques, contestations, and constraints matters because advocates like me, and probably most of you, advocates of Ubuntu, frame and present Ubuntu, this relational ontology grounded in interconnectedness, care, and communal existence. We frame it as one of Africa's signature contributions to the world. For example, Mandivamba Rukuni, who argues that no social security system based on the Western model can provide the guarantees of the extended family system as it used to be practiced across Africa. He points out that the extended family structures were so well thought out or thought through that it became practically impossible for individuals to become completely destitute. without even having a home or a family. However, in a the wide-ranging engagements that the Institute of Ubuntu Thought and Practice has had with some of you and more people, we have had to reckon with the relevance and the utility of Ubuntu in the contemporary context of a technologically mediated world, which is characterized by systems that reward efficiency over ethics, autonomy over relationality, information over wisdom, and extraction over care. So what we are going to do today is to sit. That's why the title for our conversation is Critiques, Contestations, but also what commitments do we still hold with Ubuntu? At the end of this session today, our hope is that we have these three outcomes. The first one is we have designed this Google Doc as a shared resource, which comprises the provocations, the wonderings, the reflections, the questions that we are going to gather together during this session on Ubuntu applications in the context of pressing global challenges. In other words, this is a shared document. Even after the session, you will continue to have access to it. We are trying to do this in the spirit of Ubuntu. This is shared space, shared knowledge, and would love to be able to connect together in that way. The second outcome we are hoping to have here is that we have a shared experience learning to sit with critiques, contestations, and constraints that surround Ubuntu, and do that without defaulting to denial, to dismissal, or to defense. So as we engage with some of the difficult questions today, we are really contented with sitting with those critiques. We are not trying to fix things all at once. We want to be comfortable sitting with these contestations, admitting that there are some challenges we need to face. And I think part of doing that is what gets us to our solutions. The last one is we are going to have a shared inventory of thinking shifts, lingering questions emerging from the session activities today in our conversations with the panelists. So to do that, we do have this idea that we want to spend time together. There is right now more than 100 people maybe on the call. We don't have enough time to unmute our mics and everyone to speak, but every person's voice matters. In a place like this, we did not invite the panelists as the sole experts. We invited them as part of the conversation we want to have. Every voice does matter. That's why we created this Google Doc so that as we go through this conversation, we are going to ask you to multitask, to listen and to be responsive at the same time in this Google Doc so that we can continue to converse with each other. Time is going to be tight. We can't really spend enough together in 90 minutes. So it's going to be challenging. We are going to move through some of this quickly, but we hope again that the spirit of this is we will continue to engage even after this session has ended. And when we have 100 people or more on a Google Doc, sometimes things get messy. And let's also be comfortable to sit with the messiness. And if you go to the Google Doc, Cornelia, I think thank you for dropping the Google Doc in the chat box. So if you go to the Google Doc on your left, it might look differently on your device if you are using your phone. But I think if you scroll all the way down on your phone, you'll be able to find these tabs. If you are on a laptop like me, it's laid out this way. And what we are going to start off with before we hear from our panelists, we would love to start with a check-in activity. And this check-in activity is really to focus our attention on each other. Right before we come here to listen to other people, we want to invite you to share something about yourself. It's how we show up in a space that's Ubuntu informed. The conversation is not just about Ubuntu. We want to do it with Ubuntu. So we want to invite you to go to the check-in tab. We have a prompt for you in column 2. Again, if you would like, you can put your name in column 1. For example, if it's Cornelia, Cornelia can go in here, type your name, and once you type your name, you can then respond to the prompt in column 2. And this prompt is, what is something or someone you have lost that you would love to get back? This prompt is connected to the conversation we are going to have, So we want to invite you to share something that you have lost. It could be a skill, it could be an ability, and feel free to share something that you have lost. And then when you are done sharing something you have lost, maybe this is now Jasper. So Jasper is going to read what Cornelia has typed in here and respond in column 4. And again, we want you to listen in to someone, read their post and their sharing, and then we want you to say, when I'm listening or hearing someone else post in column 2, here is some resonance that I see. What is something that strikes a chord, that connects with you at a personal level? What is that something that someone has shared that connects or resonates with yours? So this is our check-in. It's structured in such a way that you are going to share, but then you are also going to react or to respond to what someone else has shared. I see that some of you are already here, so thank you for doing that. And as we continue we are going to give each other 10 minutes to do this, do your sharing, and then do your response. If you cannot come to the Google Doc for one reason or another, we want to invite you to drop your response to prompt 2 in the chat box. And then the team we are working with from AAP and the IUTP are going to pull your response from the chat box and put it into the Google Doc. At the end of the day, this is a shared resource. We are going to come back to this over and over again, even after the session has ended. And we invite you now to share your reactions and your reaction to the prompts. We'll give each other 10 minutes. I do see a couple of people in the room who have participated in some sessions where we have used these prompts before. So we are excited that this is you are doing a second run on this. And thank you again for joining us, everyone. And again, if you are having challenges accessing the Google Doc, feel free to drop your responses in the chat box, as some of you are already doing. And then our team is going to pull it into the Google Doc. And the reason why we are putting everything in the Google Doc is to have a central place where everything is sitting. It's a one-stop shop. When you are done with this session and you want to come back, you continue to have access. And again, you are not going to be able to read everyone's post right now because we are going to throw a lot of things at you, but you can always come back after the session has ended to continue to engage with these conversations. Moses, I appreciate your some of these things are very small and subtle, but you're being able to start with a greeting here. This is really beautiful. Thank you for doing it. No pressure to anyone, but I'm just wanting to point out that we want this space to be a place of connection so that as you read someone else and look at their loss, and you are engaging with that loss from a point of resonance, it's really important to be intentional about those connections that connect us as human beings. We want to spend these 10 minutes doing this because this is probably one of the most important things we want to do. As you live today, we want you to have felt like you connected with someone, whether it's during this activity or during the time that we are going to bring in the panelists for their conversations. And you will see that the panelists don't have a whole lot of time. It's going to be quick, but it's about building these connections and these networks that we hope that will last beyond the session today. So we'll give you a few more minutes here to finish up. If you are not done yet, please go ahead, continue doing it. If you are done, obviously, you might do the same thing I'm doing. I'm going through reading what other people have posted. We'll give you maybe 3 more minutes to wrap up and then we can proceed. And as we do this, we have tasked Dr. Jasper St. Bernard to be looking through what's happening here. At some point, we are going to ask him as a discussant to pull out some threads that are visible or noticeable that are happening, some trends, and then so that he can help us to begin to process what people are posting, but what also how it connects to the conversation for today. So as you finish up, you can continue doing this. We are going to throw again a lot of people at you, a lot of things at you, obviously, and we hope that this is okay. So for right now, as you continue finishing up, we are going to transition to our panelists. And as I mentioned earlier on, if you go to the left, if you are on a computer, if you go to the left of your Google Doc, we are moving now to tab number one that's listed as the the panelists, actually tab number two for Panache. Panache is the first panelist who is going to go in preparing for this session. We requested Panache to sit with this provocation. As a philosophical thought, Ubuntu is vague and does not rest on a solid framework. The hype around Ubuntu is nothing more than idealism and nostalgia for an irredeemable African past. So we are going to ask Panache to do three things, and this applies to all the panelists. And I've listed the three things right here in the first part. We have asked them to engage with these provocations at three levels. The first level is, what is your sense of what might account for this critique? In other words, what do you see as the substance or the value of the critique? Number two, they then respond to the critique. They could challenge the premise of the critique. They could offer opinions. They could offer an alternative framework of thought. Then number three, what questions do they also sit with that are connected to this provocation? So Panashe, I would love to hand this over to you. We have 7 minutes for you, and the floor is yours. And as Panashe is speaking, we invite you all, as you listen to Panashe, what questions are coming up for you about the provocation, but also about what Panache is going to share. So Panache, over to you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me begin by saying Maskati, Makadi. I greet you in Shona, my home language, Sawubona in isiZulu, and that means we see you. And that literally means we see you not as the royal we, but as the we, I and my generation see and recognize you and your generations. That is what we mean by saying Sawubona, recognizing that for us, Ubuntu means an intergenerational sense of being. Now, as Upenya has noted, there are, of course, many important critiques, internal and external critiques of Ubuntu, and it's important to be able to level at which part or where are we locating ourselves. And for me, where I enter this is as a Southern African, particularly from Zimbabwe, South Africa, having grown up in the post-apartheid, so-called post-apartheid eras of South Africa and post-apartheid era in Zimbabwe. And that's really important because Ubuntu was used, Hunu, as we call it in Shona, Ubuntu in isiZulu is Xhosa, Butu in Setswana, Sepedi, is or was a central part of what was understood as the transitional justice for the transition from white minority rule to black majority rule. But what I always like to ground people in when rethinking and challenging what we understand by Ubuntu and how it has been popularized, because there's a clear disconnect between how it has been popularized in the global imagination versus how it is actually practiced amongst us as Abantu, as Wanu, Black peoples or people, those of Ntu, those of Nu, the conceptualization of Ubuntu. So I'll start with this. In isiZulu, we say, akukho zinyani lemvubu ladliwa zingwenya kwaceba iziziba. It never happens that the hippo's child is eaten by the calf, rather that the hippo's child is eaten by the crocodile and the pool remains still. I invite you to think about what that might mean. There must be blood. In other words, there must be consequences. And I often invoke that, which is I don't call them proverbs, I call them dicta or maxims. And not necessarily retaliation. I see someone spoke about retaliation. The point here is that there must be consequences. If there is a wrong done unto me, there is a sense that there must be consequences. And it is a direct refutation to the popularized vision of of Ubuntu that came through the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was headed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And part of what had been proposed, there was this idea that restorative justice based in African jurisprudence, and particularly Ubuntu, means that we will have amnesty. And that was part of the justification. And part of why there has been a serious disconnect by many Black people to the TRC as really the global exemplar for transitional justice is that there were never any consequences for the long history of dispossession. And so when we go back to this idea that there must be consequences if you do wrong unto my child, as a mother, and particularly speaking about the ways in which Ubuntu is spoken about in terms of community care, making sure that we protect. As a mother, it is my duty. I cannot sit by as you do something to my child and say it is Ubuntu that means that I will leave, that there are no consequences. Ubuntu does require consequences, and the Ubuntu that many of us practice amongst us in our families means that you do not say sorry with your mouth. We speak about ideas of ukuhlaula, for example, in Shona kuripa, the idea of reparations, material reparations in particular. And so the popularized Ubuntu that we had really had a huge disconnect from the way in which we practice it, not just historically, but also presently. So that critique that we hear that, oh, Ubuntu has no basis, let's now distinguish many of the contestations that we had with Ubuntu in South Africa in in particular and in Southern Africa. On one level, there is the critique that has been leveled by many, and the huge issue that we have is that there are many African philosophers who do not speak African languages, and do not base themselves. So we have this idea of Ubuntu without Abantu, Ubuntu without Isintu. So, i.e., Ubuntu can become a company, it can become anything really, but what it actually is. You don't actually have to base it in the cultures of the people from whom it emanates. And you don't have to practice Ubuntu in a way that actually benefits Black peoples or the indigenous peoples of the land. And that's part of the central critique that especially those of us who are Africanist scholars have had on the ways in which Ubuntu is something that becomes quite disconnected. It becomes the Christianized version of Ubuntu that we had someone like Desmond Tutu promulgate, and there's been a huge range of scholarship around that. The Christianized Ubuntu that says forgive and forget, that is not an African culture. There are always consequences amongst us. Number two, then there is the idea that there are many scholars who work through African philosophy without knowing African languages. You cannot in this day and age or ever think of becoming a classic scholar without knowing Greek or Latin. It would be a joke. But somehow when it is African philosophy, it becomes a free-for-all. You don't have to do the work of grounding yourself. So that is part of the critique that we then deal with in the post-apartheid era, such that people can say, one of our famous public intellectuals, the late Eusebius Makaiser, said that Ubuntu is whatever the judge has said, whatever, it depends on what the judge ate for breakfast. And that's the situation that we end up coming up with. And so for me, as a scholar in particular, part of the work that I have done is going back, one, into the archive, the oral archive that I live with every day, and thinking about what is the Ubuntu that we practice every day within our families when there are disputes. How do we govern that? With what are you apologizing? Those ways in which we practice repair amongst our families. But also as a historian, I go back into the archives. I particularly work with the 19th century African language archives. And just on my own, I found more than 500 African language archives or texts referring to Ubuntu for Black audiences. And what has been particularly interesting for me has been seeing how Ubuntu is discussed in the context of the 19th century wars of dispossession in the region, and seeing how people, for example, are talking about Ubuntu as an ethics of war and conquest. So it becomes a very different kind of Ubuntu that many of us are used to. That's why I invoked Akuko Zinyane Lemvubu, Ladliwa Zingwenyo Kwaceba Iziziba. There is a way in which long before there was a Geneva Convention on war ethic and war conduct, Black peoples, in particular Xhosa speaking intellectuals, which is my areas of focus. That's what my forthcoming book is about, Conquer and Incorporate, Ubuntu as an Ethics of War and Conquest. We see how Black people are thinking through Ubuntu in terms of questions of sovereignty, in terms of question of land, in terms of question of violence and conflict. So we see a very different kind of Ubuntu than the kind of unified, non-racial pacifism that then becomes presented to the world and is very easily digestible, because then it actually then rationalizes a lot of the post-apartheid dispossession as black people, because it becomes this kumbaya, rainbow is neither here nor there, anything goes, because Africans are supposedly so forgiving as to not demand consequences for wrong. But that is not the Ubuntu that is practiced historically or presently, and that's the work that we do. And for myself, I think I've answered all of the questions. One, which is what are the levels of critique? They're the external critiques, and I think particularly for those who might not be rooted and then have said that, oh, this is something that was just, in vogue by nationalists or elite nationalists in the transition from white minority rule to Black majority rule. And then there are the internal critiques by those of us who are the Africanist scholars who speak about the fact that this is completely disconnected from our lived experiences and from our languages as a key source of knowledge systems. And the third aspect then is then to say, right, if you go into these archives, and many of these archives are completely disregarded because, again, the issue of language, many of us who work as so-called professional historians in post-apartheid South Africa do not speak African languages. So while South Africa has the world's oldest African language archive, beginning in 1838 with Xhosa newspapers, that has been completely disregarded and underutilized because of the fact that we've had a historic exclusion of Black scholars from the academy. But we're seeing a big shift now that we have a lot more Black people, particularly those of us who are rooted in languages. And again, you don't have to be Black to know any African languages. It's just about a regard for the language in and of itself. And that also is quite important around the ways in which we as Africans as well sometimes do not take our African languages seriously enough, such that what will happen is that we're always looking towards the Western analog to and Western ways in which Ubuntu can become legible. So one of the major critiques I've given, for example, and I know Upenyo needs me to conclude soon, and I can give a link to where I've delineated some of these critiques and gone quite systematically, is the way in which we translate umuntu ngumuthi ngabanye bantu into I am because we are. That is not the translation. It is a person is a person through other people. Where we arrive at I am because we are from John Beatty writing in 1969 in African Religions and Philosophy as a Christian theologian seeking to make African religions and philosophy legible in Western terms. And in particular, I am because we are is the cognate or the African analogy to Western theology or Western philosophies. I think, therefore, I am. That's where that comes from. And there are many consequences that come from then importing a very specific I within the West into African philosophy. The idea here is not that African philosophies are hermetically sealed and have nothing to do with anything of the rest of the world, but it is about being specific to the specific claims that are emanating from African languages. And this is why, for example, we see again, because it has tended to be many African theologians like your Desmond Tutus who are elaborating Ubuntu in terms of its compatibility with Christianity and Western liberal democracy. So that is part of the key problem with how Ubuntu then becomes something that is globally palatable, particularly thinking about its compatibility to liberal and Western norms, as opposed to what it actually means for us as Black people. I can tell you now that if I had gone on at the Truth and Reconciliation Committee Commission and said, that would not have been a popularized version of Ubuntu. Africans demanding land and restitution would not have been popular. It was not compatible with the compromises of the negotiated settlement. So we see how politics, our lack of attention to the intricacies of African languages have meant that there has been a distorted vision of Ubuntu that has been popularized globally and subsequently then rejected by many of us who have to deal with the consequences of Ubuntu that rationalizes our dispossession, Ubuntu that rationalizes Ubuntu without Abantu. And I'm looking forward to discussing more of that as we go on today.
Great. Thank you, Panashe. I had suspected we have more stuff to put on the table than we can handle with the time, so we will manage our time and remain flexible as we go. So right now we want to shift to Stephen Wanjezi. Thank you for joining us. The provocation we sent to Stephen is this. I'll read it out to you and then I'll give time over to Stephen. Ubuntu is meaningful, useful, and applicable only in traditional settings. And I'm putting traditional and modern here in italics because there's a story there, obviously. So Ubuntu is meaningful, useful, and applicable only in traditional settings, but not in modern societies. Clinging on to Ubuntu and to other indigenous knowledge systems is what is holding Africa and Africans back. So Stephen, over to you. I'm hoping that we can try to wing this in 7 or 8 minutes so that we have time to respond to the reactions we are getting from attendees. And as Stephen speaks, please feel free to drop anything here in the document responding to Stephen or yourself responding to the prompt as well. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Upenyo, and I will not go into the definitions because Panashe has done a good job on analyzing what Ubuntu really is. But with my own provocation, I think that the key issue that we need to contend with and accept is that Ubuntu, as we call it, or Ubuntu, as it is called in the Southern African languages, was coined and thrived in a setting where families lived together, extended families lived in the same valley, and the means of coexistence were the human to human interactions and exchanges. That if I wanted to build a house, I couldn't build it alone. I needed all my neighbors and relatives and friends to come and give me a hand. If I lost a relative, I couldn't grieve alone. In that period, I'm not cooking. All the neighbors are doing the cooking, and they come and help me grieve through this. If I my son wanted to get married to the choosing of a wife that would be compatible with our family, with our norms, that would be hardworking, that would have all the values we are looking for, would come from the surveillance and information that would come from the people that you share the circle with. Now, we coexisted in that, and the means of exchanging these values and properties and wealth were mutual exchange. Suddenly came the colonization, which came with money as a means of exchange, which came with a different type of technology. And therefore, suddenly we could now be able to get money and pay a mason to come and build my house. I sort of dispensed of the relationships I had with my neighbors. Suddenly, I could travel in a car, in an airplane, and I go to a different land where I don't have people that would have seen so and so's daughter and recommended that girl for my wife and for my son, and we fall in love. And before you know, I come home with this. So the knife that cut the Ubuntu network was the means of exchange that came with colonization. And I'm specifically referring to cash as a medium of exchange, to technology as a substitute for a source of what we needed to survive. And from that point, the African indigenous civilization was like it was picked and put in a deep freezer of history, and a superseding, completely different approach to life came. And we were schooled and socialized through church, through school, through media to accept and absorb this new way of living. Unfortunately, it was interpreted that all that was needed to measure human development were materials. That's why you have gross national product as a measure of satisfaction, gross national domestic product. The world has chased this materialistic satisfaction over time, and we still have issues with loneliness as the main killer, dementia that is coming from all sorts of things. And we are now beginning to realize that in Ubuntu, there was more than exchange of materials. So, where are we today? And I would just want to pose questions. Was Ubuntu equivalent to philanthropy? Was Ubuntu a favor? Was Ubuntu volunteerism? Is Ubuntu an automatic acceptance of consequences that you slap this cheek and I just turn the other one because I want to be seen to be humane? What I think is going to force the whole world to come back to this Ubuntu question is that we have devastated everything in the search for material. We have removed the human from development. I very much love what the king of Bhutan said, that instead of gross national product, we should measure success or development from or using gross national happiness. We have now tried even to hide some of our offsprings in outer space, in spaceships, so that when we have destroyed the environment and someone has touched the trigger of the nuclear bomb and finished everybody, some of our offsprings can survive where these disasters cannot reach. We are beginning to realize that it is not possible to chase human material outside the humane coexistence. And therefore, those of us or you who are practicing and who are researching and recording the values that were embedded in Ubuntu should get even more motivated, because it's just about time that the materialistic world is going to come back to look for what was seen as primitive to be embedded in modern life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I am going back to share my screen so that we can move on to our next panelist. And thank you for those who are posting their reflections, your questions. Please continue to do this even after the session is ended. Like we mentioned, this document will be available for you. So we are moving on now to Melissa. And here is the prompt that we have Melissa working on. Due to Ubuntu's communal and collectivist orientation, there is grave danger of sacrificing personal freedoms and individual rights for the sake of the so-called community and collective. Melissa, over to you.
Thank you so much, and greetings to everyone who's joined us and for sharing your very personal, since my question is on personhood and, personalizing matters. Thank you to all in the audience who've shared a lot. I've been following keenly. I think I'll just pick up from where Dr. Stephen left off, that, we come to this conversation from the point of loss and the point of depletion. And so, if so far from even Panache's explanation of Ubuntu as a discipline or a philosophy that is, in search of that homegrown base, this is one of those particular critiques that, does the person then exist? Because it's been centered for so long in this quest for materialism or capitalism or greed. So why care about this communal nature that, after all, does not make sense in the world orders that we follow so far? So the first thing that comes to mind when I saw that is, yes, this is especially a question for the Ubuntu student of today. And immediately you see that, then you have to tell them very quickly before you lose them that this is the stuff that makes Ubuntu, because Ubuntu itself has that inherent admission that without the other, you cannot be, in whatever formulations. Now that Panache has brought up John Beatty, I will quickly confess that I am a student of Professor John Beatty. When you were speaking, I said, oh my goodness, you have come for us East Africans and our canon from the Anglican Church. Why I bring him up is, yes, indeed, he's the one who brought up that maxim of I am because we are, and it has been popularized. But this is necessarily how most of us who have been indoctrinated in putting our individual natures before the community or before our, fellow brethren, need to enter the discussion. I think we need to know what is it that makes us disconnected, as you had said, or, Dr. Stevens said, that severed part, that fractured locus. Where did it begin? We have to enter from that contestation. And so Professor Mbiti, in his book, how I read it, he says he was critical about Western traditions like the church or Christianity or evangelization, that it was not bringing the African to terms how he knows or she knows religion. It's not a constant companion. you know? So what are those things in our individual lives that don't make Ubuntu obvious, or as Dr. Stevens said, automatic? This is where I think I would start putting many, many questions for each of us who are having this clash of civilizations, these confusions about who we are, whether we are Africans, whether we are proponents of Ubuntu in our scholarship, whatever the case may be, because that praxis is needed. So I love that Professor Mbiti actually said, let me play to the tune of my own people as a canon of the Anglican Church, who was excommunicated, you know, write this very controversial text saying, hey, look, evangelists, Africans are notoriously religious. You have to ensure that they see religion in their terms, and that is in nature, and that is in their own practices. You know, you call something witchcraft, they would call it consultations, you know, with persons who have special gifts in their community. You know, you call something taboo, right? To them, you know, it's a particular talent. So bring it close to them. Don't only put it on one day, on Sundays. You know, that's the only time they worship. Put it every day because they see, you know, the connectedness between them, their nature, their creator, and so on and so forth in very many aspects. There's variety and multiplicity. So I am one person who finds Mbiti's scholarship very interesting in navigating the personhood and community for many of us who've been indoctrinated in the Western tradition, and it's most of us who are actually colonial subjects. But other than the discipline of Ubuntu philosophy and which one works and which one doesn't work, because there are various philosophers on that, I like that we are also discussing the duty. What is the duty in our lived realities? How do we apply it, right? What is this communal architecture that we have today? And indeed, in our, you know, concept note for today's discussion, we've been speaking about technology, we've been speaking about communities of trust, but I was also thinking about the others. And here is where my decolonial feminist scholarship always brings me to think about marginalizations. One of the critiques of Ubuntu is that sometimes it sustains marginalizations of women, perhaps who are not custodians of certain values, um, perhaps persons with disabilities. There were certain derogatory terms that made them not feel part of the community. And maybe people are not particularly gifted, you know? So in coming up with this idea of communal or connectedness in a community sense and what we can do moving forward, because I'm always solution-based and because I'm also feminist, I ran to my intellectual mother, Michelle Remugo, who says, look, there's, and may her soul rest in peace. And she wrote about Utu and feminism. Utu is, I guess, our translation of Ubuntu in East Africa, or especially the Swahili language. She says that we have to twist and bend. So she gives us a way of playing with this task. You create liberated zones. This is a very Marxist definition. Liberated zones in the places that you work, in the churches that you so believe in the mosques that you so frequent, in the neighborhoods that you are shoveling snow at, for those who are going through stormy seasons. It is in the professions where you teach, you know. It is also with the environment, I think, that many of us who are saying it's a call back to nature. And not to be unafraid to say there are various solutions, and I'm going to twist and bend them and not be afraid to say I'm entering this discussion also with those who dominate over us and show them a different way. So create those liberated zones wherever you can. You don't have to be so tied to an ethnicity or tied to a tribe or so on and so forth. These are some of the things that are questionable with our, you know, so-called traditions. But at the end of the day, there's no one single answer. And I think in that way, we stop being disposable and everyone can fit in to the conversation in one way or the other. So that was what I think about persona and the communal or liturgy.
Thank you, Melissa. And then moving on now to Femi. Here is the provocation we gave to Femi to speak to. Dr. Leo Zulu, I see that you are on the call. This is a provocation that Dr. Leo Zulu gave us when we were sitting around a circle in Victoria Falls, where we did a listening to understand retreat in 2024, I think, or 25, one of those years. So, is Ubuntu always positive? Are there downsides of Ubuntu? Can we separate Ubuntu from individual behavior? Is it like Ubuntu is always good and people can be bad? So, Femi, we're giving you your 7 minutes.
So please confirm you can hear me because I've had some issues.
Yes, we can hear you.
And thank you for the invite. And yeah, it's always an honor to be with people. I've given in the midst of doing some very heavy work at the moment. I was thinking of this, and I wanted to start actually with a bit of an anecdote. I live in Dar es Salaam, born UK, Nigerian parents, and I've been living in East Africa for the last 14 years or so. And where I live is near a fishing village, and this is just a few months ago. There was an incident where one of the fishermen, friends, they're amongst friends, had a bit too much to drink and glassed the other friend in an argument. And of course, police were involved. And what the police said, which was really interesting, said, well, we can do it the book way or we can do it our way. How do you want to deal with this situation? And they decided to do it our way. And this goes to what Panesh said, and I think this is very poignant. You've wronged this man. You're going to look after him. You're going to tend to his wounds. You're going to feed him and all the rest for a period of time. And that happened. And some months later, these guys remain friends. So the point here is there were consequences. It wasn't a question of turning the cheek or you're let off the hook. He had to make recompense, and they had to do that in order to be restored to friendship and restored to the community. So, but what's interesting is that the idea, once there's value in what is the end result, then a solution is found within the context of individuals and community. Oftentimes, we have this notion that is a subjugation, that Ubuntu is a subjugation of individuality. I've never understood it that way. When one thinks of the whether it's the definition we accept or not, but the linguistic definition, a person is a person because of persons. Already we're here in personhood and the individuality, the individual aspect of that phrase and that understanding as part and parcel of the amalgam. So community and personhood connects in and of itself and interdimensionality. And when we think about, African cultures, pluralized, and perhaps global cultures, it's not just African cultures, you have that sense that our dimensionality, physical, spiritual, mental, that are often separated. But many of our cultures on the Africa do not separate these forces. They are brought together. And what we've in lots of ways, there is this anxiety around separation that, I would suggest is not solely Western, but certainly Western in the modernity sense. That separation of dimensions that has led to, if you like, the atomization of so much. We've talked about money, we've talked about communities, we've talked about cities and so on. That atomization causing anxiety and so on. When we look at African cultures that have gone through so much and are still going through so much, you find nucleus of that togetherness that seems to be impenetrable. And it's that part that I think it's not whether it is always positive, it is the force that it represents if applied in the correct way, does it yield to positivity? Because if we take person is a person is a person, it's not necessarily suggesting that the outcome is positive. If a person is a person is a person, and all those persons are very bad, evil people, what is the output? So in a sense, it becomes an innate qualitative aspect, putting on top of that a quality of we are together, individual and community, and we have an outcome to go towards. And I think if and this is through, conversation, one can come to this from the area of research and the linguistic aspects, which is very, very poignant. I totally understand what Panesh is saying in that regard. But at the same time, it's also lived experience and the unpacking of the experiences that we have that remain valid. We shouldn't decouple that because there is, if you like, an idiom, there is a way in which this ought to be looked at. There has to be the sense of we are ourselves part of the fractal of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a fractal, as is personhood. So in that respect, what we're saying is that if we understand that we are part of that force, then it can yield to positivity. It ought to yield to positivity, but don't take it for a foregone conclusion. I think that is, I'm not saying this is the definition, but we kind of tend to focus on the positivity, which of course we ought to, but at the same time, understanding the force so that when we now are able to apply and understand and unpack what is going on, say, for example, what is going on in the West, we can look at what we have as, if you like, I wouldn't even say a contesting force, because to say I think, therefore I am, and juxtapose that within the Ubuntu paradigm, it simply doesn't make sense because you're separating out all these aspects of life that are interconnected by definition, because we are a fractal and we have never ever come here alone. The ancestral life and sorry, just 1 second, please. I'm being disturbed here. Sorry, just 1 second, please. Yeah, the manner of which we are able to come together. Sorry, I've been disturbed and taken off my flow here. The fractal of who we are is as peoples, and how we juxtapose that in, if you like, what is going on in Western civilization at the moment, which impacts us, is not somehow able to reflect a reality that makes sense when you go through all the things, all the decouplements of what's going on in societies as we stand now. We see environmental issues. We see economic models that don't make any sense. You have externalities, you have all of these forces that somehow don't make sense in a very basic level. So when we come now to look at a force such as Ubuntu, there's something that's poignantly important here. There's a simplicity about how, and I'm not saying simplistic, because fractal knowledge, as all of you scholars out there, and I'm not a scholar in that sense, you will know how intricate fractal dimensionality is. It's superly complex, but yet it's simple. And so that simplicity of what has been part of Africa's, and remember Africa being the seat of civilization, is no coincidence that simplicity of knowledge, of being closest to the source, not just about personhood, but in terms of the environment, in terms of the cosmos. And to coin a phrase of one of our friends, Jose Cosa, talking about Cosmo Ubuntu, I think is important because it offers a reconnect that has been lost. Because Panache is right that it flows through African experiences, but of course, as I said, we are fractals. The fractal of human existence flows from the center. I think I'll leave it there. I'm not sure I've answered everything. I hope I have. Can we separate? Is Ubuntu, is it always good and people can be bad? I think I've answered that. It's a force field. Of course, we want it to be always positive, but we're talking about persons. So in that sense, it's about understanding who we are and reflecting on who we are and as the whole. And putting, if you like, the final layer on top is because it will always be, if you like, part and parcel of what we see and how we view of our uh, understanding of what's before us impacts the outcome. I mean, we can't deny that, but the force field, as yes, Ubuntu offers interconnectivity in the correct way, yes, it should be positive.
Thank you, Femi. I know that your audio was becoming jumpy a little bit there, but I think we could all hear you. And again, as we continue, let's drop any reflections, questions, wonderings we have for Femi in the document, and as well as your own reaction to the prompts. Would love to hear as well what's your reaction to the prompt. So we invited Dr. Jasper St. Bernard to help us begin to, I think it's already happening, but a lot of you have been processing what has been happening. We also would like to process this across the different panelists, link it back to our check-in activity, but also bring in our lived experiences into conversation with these threads that are coming up. So this is the provocation we gave to Jasper. What are you noticing about the threads and the storylines emerging from the check-in activity, from the panelists' responses to the provocations, from attendees' posts in the in-session activities document? What is evident and what is clear? What is confusing? What is contested? What is missing? What is unspoken? And anything else you are seeing, Jasper, to help us process what's happening. And we have 7 minutes for you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning here. Good day. You can hear me? Everything's good?
Yes, we can hear
Oh,
you.
okay. I'm gonna, man, 7 minutes. It's not fair. I'm gonna do my best. I'm gonna try. I should start with how I'm gonna follow Dr. Panashi's lead, where I enter from this space. So I'm a philosopher of African American thought, late 19th, early 20th century. I focus primarily on Ida B. Wells and lynching, her anti-lynching work in America. And so that is kind of what brings me to this discussion of Ubuntu. And what is interesting is like I was immediately I'll go through the day and I'll hopefully be able to thread some of these thoughts. If I violate, I mean, just blame the clock and not me. I wish I could go sit somewhere quiet for months and think about all of this. I was immediately struck by the vulnerability of the initial introduction, the early activity. There were when I started to chronicle, it was 93 people, and just to see how willing everyone was to share like deeper parts of themselves when in the question of loss really jumped out to me with no warm up, and it had me interrogate my relationship to this group of digital strangers. Some of the people I do know on this call, but there are a lot of people I did not know, and there were deep things that were shared immediately. And the reason I highlight that is because one of the things that jumped out that I feel like is a through line is one of the things that seems to be missing in Western thought, Western philosophy, is that vulnerability. And we see it play out like in the current. So in America, you know, if you're here or you're paying attention, there is a bit of a crisis that is happening that we are trying to, and when I say this is the royal we're trying to determine just how unprecedented this crisis is. And what is always interesting to me is the unwillingness by many um, to admit or to allow that there may be something fundamental in how we see each other that goes back, that precedes us as individuals, that we sort of ingest as we're schooled, that is the seedbed of this mistreatment. Like what that may be the brutal nature. We've had a couple people die in Minnesota. No, well, actually, I read last night that the count is 9 that ICE has killed in America this year alone. 9 people have died at the hands of ICE, and that's not an official statistic. I haven't had a chance to like double confirm that, but that's what I was reading. 2 very publicized killings on screen that have happened. And so one of the things that I was trying to do, I was in Stellenbosch a few years ago, and I was trying to ask myself the question of what Ubuntu could tell me about the lynching, the nature of this brutal, thousands of people gather at times, and they would just brutally destroy a human. And like, what is underneath that? And can Ubuntu help us make sense of this? Dr. Panache immediately challenged my reaching. I felt like if I could erase the chapter in that book, I would do it. If it wasn't in a solid book and I could get rid of it, after her presentation, I would have gotten rid of it. It would go because there was a like it one of the things that came out, and it continued to haunt me with each presentation, is the baggage that comes into trying to utilize a concept. There's a bit of projection there. And often, if that projection is not attended to, there is a lot that is carried into what seems like just using a concept, right? So, for instance, I'm here in America. So, who is I? Who is we? And this is what came out in Dr. Stevens' presentation, right? This question of the deep freezer concept, this idea that actually we have long, when I say we again, if this is not you, don't, I'm sorry, like, but many of us have put this concept on a shelf and then have sort of been playing with this bastardized sort of muddied concept that we're calling Ubuntu, but it's not touching the idea in any sense of the way. But because of the role Africa plays in American thought and all these things, it's this primitive, oh, let's go back to this thing, but it's not accounting for what is being brought into the concept. And this continued with Dr. Melissa and Dr. Femi, and this question of like, who is this I, not just in the concept itself, but who is the I contemplating the concept, right? So it begins to become this sort of meta contemplation that makes it very difficult. Man, that's 7 minutes, isn't it? Is that 6? Anyway, I'll wrap it up. So it's muddy, but that's sort of like a cartoonish way to deal with this. What is interesting here is that even as we sit here, Ubuntu and interrogate Ubuntu, it is like dynamic in that it is changing, and that like who I am as I come into has to be attended if I'm going to be able to deal with this in any way, and almost in a premeditative way, because this Western I that is depersonalized and is seeking to brutalize for the sake of attainment is smuggled in if we're not careful, and they can really poison the concept and then give us this sort of romanticized idea that's not touching on anything and could actually harm how I understand the we if I'm not attending to it. There's so much more to say, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jasper. So I am looking at our clock. We have 19 minutes and we cannot go beyond the 19 minutes. So I want to start by, as we prepare to land this plane, I want to start by thanking you all for indulging us to run this session this way. There's so much we are asking you to do, to listen, but also to be responsive. Our hope is that What we do today is a beginning of a conversation together. We are not trying to land this plan in a way where we have conclusive and then we are kind of settled the issues. We think that there is so much that we need to sit together with, and hopefully we can convince the AAP team to give us another time to kind of then pull apart what we have just shared. What I want to come to right now as we try to come to a close is that the goal for this session is that we can take some time to sit with the critiques, to sit with the contestations and the constraints without rushing to answer things. Answers can be cheap. And sometimes we are responding with answers to questions we don't even understand. So I think it's important to step back and sit with those critiques. Maybe say, where is this critique coming from? And where is a place in our hearts where we can engage with the critique on its own terms? And if we can do that long enough, we might already be partway through solving some of those issues. And a lot of us, sometimes when something comes up and we feel very passionately about, we default to denial, to dismissal, or to defense. So we would love to invite each of us again to recognize the point today was not to answer all the questions. The point was to actually say, what are the questions and how might we sit with those questions? So for the panelists, we don't have a whole lot of time. I hope that if we can do 2 minutes each, and the 2 minutes is like 2 minutes, 2 minutes, because if we go more than 2 minutes, we are going to not give another panelist time to respond. So, but looking at the things that came up in the conversation on your page in the Google Doc, if you wanted to spend 2 minutes to maybe react or point some things out, and as we do that, to the rest of us in the room, we have 15 minutes. We want to invite you to come to this final tab in the Google Doc. It's talking about thinking shifts. So following the session activities and conversations, how has your understanding and your thinking about Ubuntu applications in the 21st century changed or shifted? Maybe your thinking hasn't changed or shifted as such, but maybe something has become either deeper or clearer, it has been affirmed, or maybe something actually got disrupted or become complicated, or you are less certain now about certain things. You can also write about that. So feel free to come in here as you again multitask and listen as the panelists give their closing remarks. And then you can also drop. This is where, if you would ask me, I'm really excited to see what your lingering questions would look like. Because if we have another chance, and we will have another chance, we would love to sit with the questions that you have as we close. What questions are lingering for you? And these questions could be questions for yourself, if we could start there. What questions do you have for yourself? What questions might you have for the panelists, for each other here in the room? As the panelists do their closing remarks, would love to invite you to come to this page as we come to a close. And again, we have 15 minutes. We do have not more than 2 minutes each. Again, we want to ask the panelists to go. I'll pull up your page as we go through this. Panache, I want to start with you, and 2 minutes. I know it's not enough time, but that's what we have. 2 minutes. Panache.
Okay. May I go? I'm seeing just your face, so I can't see
Yes, you
myself.
can go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is really wonderful. And what I just wanted to pick up is a lot of what we keep talking about is intellectualization of this. And there's this way in which we have a false binary that something which is felt is not thought, for example. And if it is written, that's the only form of intellectuals or intellectualism that we have. We have always had intellectuals. That's why we have Ikiko, for example, within our cultures. Xhosa speaking people will speak about it. One of the worst misconceptions, and again, the issues of translation, is when we talk about so-called praise poets. It's never praise poetry. That was meant to be a way of critical, amabongi and that sort of thing. Is the idea is that they are always doing a critical discourse, a critical way of reflecting. That is why we had Dare in Shona, for example. We have Amaband. Like there are many different places and fora for deliberation and discussion. There was always a critical interplay with these things. So there's a way in which we think that Africans are just living, they're just doing, there's no critical discourse. Being a critical discourse or intellectual work does not necessarily mean writing a book, but it is simply critical reflection on the conditions in which you find yourself in. And that is part of why in my own work, I both look at both the oral and written discourses, and we see how Ubuntu actively changes according to, yes, there's core principles around ensuring the continuity of life in the land in which it is lived. But for example, that is why, and I put that in the Guardian piece, why there's Ubuntu as a critical philosophy of race. That is why in many of our African languages, when you talk about Abantu or Wanu, you are specifically meaning Black people. That is part of how historically we came to have a critical discourse of race, which is to do with a historical judgment about a lack of ethics of those who have dispossessed us of our land. And again, so we're seeing how, because of changing circumstances, people who we initially welcomed as Abadu Basemzini, people of another house, visitors to be welcomed, then show themselves to be settlers, show themselves to be invaders, and therefore we no longer regarded them as people, a position which can change provided that they atone for that dispossession. So here, the point here is that some of the ways in which we relate to ideas of intellectualism or even ideas of the so-called traditional, there's a reason why Isintu is not an accurate translational cognate of traditional. Isintu simply means that which is based in our culture, just like in Shona, Chiwa Nu simply means that of our culture, or that of Nu, that of Ntu. That is not translating traditional. And so part of the misconception is that we're looking for something that's stuck in the primordial, pristine African past. But clearly, if we take or pay attention to debate, discourse, deliberation within African cultures and African societies, we'll see we've had a long history of deliberation and contestation, just like we're doing right now. Our ancestors in the 19th century, 18th century also did the very same thing. That's why we know in all of our cultures, Dare, the Indaba, all of those spaces of communal deliberation, you cannot get to consensus without deliberation and debate. That is the work of being an intellectual. That is part of an intellectual culture within our society. So this is really important to move away from the false binaries that the West makes about thinking and feeling. An intellectual means someone who writes. An intellectual cannot be someone who is speaking. The work of intellection is simply something that uses whatever tool is available at the time, whether it's a pen, whether it's a song, whether it is amabongo or what we call isbongo, or what you call so-called, or which is mistranslated as praise poetry, because we know a true imbongi wesizwe, someone who was raised to the level of a national bard, was because of the ways in which they reflected the critical consciousness of a nation. You cannot just be someone who sings the king's praises. You had to bring in the critical discourses to show. When you look at people like S.E.K. Mqai, for example, who Nelson Mandela speaks of as one of the central intellectual forces, if you go through his poetry, if you go through his work, that is a real example of the fact that we've always had intellectuals and they've always been a critical part of the continuation and contestation of Ubuntu from time immemorial to the present that we have today.
Thank you, Panashe. We are going to breeze through the remaining pieces. So, Stephen, we are down to a minute and a half. So, Stephen, a minute and a half. By the time we get to Jasper, Jasper will give you 20 seconds.
No,
So
it's
let's
okay.
see how it works. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think I am not going to try and respond to the things raised on my page, because this is a whole philosophy of humanity, and I would be hypocritical to think that I have the capacity to, in 2 minutes, do it justice. But I will throw some questions that have arisen out of the conversation to me. And one is, has Ubuntu now moved from a way of living to an extrinsic intellectual academic engagement where people simply gather and talk about it for purposes of professional development and degree achievement? And are the scholars that we are quoting people who are actually living in this lifestyle, or are these people who have done scholarship and written things but have no real experience and interaction with Ubuntu as a life or a lifestyle? And secondly, therefore, what do we do to bring those people whose lifestyle is Ubuntu into the conversation of people who have written and can be quoted? Or are we going to continue in our own self-aggrandizement and talk on behalf of people who live a lifestyle about a lifestyle that we are actually not living? Next is Ubuntu exclusively African? Are we the only one who have that spirit? And if so, are we now trying to make the rest of the world accept our way of living, and therefore we risk creating a new form of African colonialism above and over other people? Is it possible for us to find other ways of finding Ubuntu aspects in other people's ways of living? And I will pick small examples. In the Western world, someone will sneeze and another one will say, bless you. Someone will get a birthday or Christmas card. Are these not signs of Ubuntu? Is it not time for us to look for these uniform practices and make people open up to this discussion, rather than feeling that we are on a vengeance mission because of the historical grievances and trying to colonize others? And finally, how do we remove politics from Ubuntu as a lifestyle? How do we avoid people falling back to defense and look for solution for human cross-cultural coexistence?
Thank you, Stephen. Melissa, you might cue me for this. We are not going to give you a minute. We want you to kind of give your farewell remarks. It's just like you could say bye and then we pass on to Femi. He says the same thing. So, Melissa, we want to make sure we respect people's time and end in time.
No problem. My reflections were just on gender and where to read more about Ubuntu. And I think my nugget will be definitely have a session on gender and Ubuntu, and then definitely have a repository of all these books we've been quoting, and also how to empower these other indigenous repositories of knowledge, whether oral or whether, in arts, in song form, and so on and so forth. So yeah, looking forward to the next versions.
Thank you. Femi, the same thing.
Yeah, I would, promote how actualization of Ubuntu. How do we inculcate? How do we refine? How do we use the force? As I said, I liked some of the comments in there which talk about it Ubuntu being a malleable form, and is for us to create within that force, if you like. And also, there's one reference to a Christian doctrine, which I see definitely as Ubuntu. I love myself as I love others, although it's the othering within or the Ubuntu concept. So, yeah, I think these understandings and being able to pause it. I love what Professor or Dr. Stephen said about understanding that, Ubuntu exists in other parts of the globe necessarily. So, as I said earlier, we are fractals of each other.
Great. Jasper, we want to end with you. Again, we won't have enough time to give you. I know that you have a lot to help us process, but we want just for you to say bye and then we'll organize another event.
Yeah. No, thank you. I just want to thank all the panelists and like just this was a lot to chew on. And hopefully when we come back together, we can talk about it. One of the things I will be looking, and maybe I could bring that the because I'm working on some stuff with Steve with James Baldwin and things. And I think there are not analogs. I don't want to use that, but it is interesting. I think there are resonances in thinking about this fractalness that Femi is talking about. So I just thank you everybody for just giving us so much to chew on, and I appreciate you all.
Great. So in the remaining 2 minutes, I want to go where we started. The goal for this session was not to be conclusive about issues. We wanted to create a space where we could ask questions, where we could connect, and where we could sit with those provocations as a continuation of a conversation that we are all invested in. So we want to invite you to continue engaging in the document, and we'll be in conversation. I think that AAP does have contact information for everyone. We will be able to communicate through that, but we are going to again continue this conversation. This is the work we are doing as part of the Institute of Ubuntu Thought and Practice, and we are excited to partner with AAP on this, with all of you as well. And we hope that this is a conversation that will continue to go forward. So, Justin or the AAP team, I wanted to hand over to you to close us off in the remaining 2 minutes.
Hi, Penny. I think it's on me to close us out. So I'm Amy Jameson. I'm co-director of the Alliance for African Partnership, and I just want to thank everyone today. Thank you, Openu, for organizing this, and the Institute for Ubuntu Thought and Practice. But thank you to the panelists, to everyone who joined us across regions, disciplines, and lived experiences today. I saw many names that I'm very familiar with, and then some who I think are joining us for the first time. So I love that interaction. And I think Jasper said this as well. I want to appreciate all of you who shared from these spaces of vulnerability and from your diverse knowledge that you shared today. That's really made this event so rich. And so I'll just close quickly because I know we're at our end, but I think today's dialogue asked us to sit with the complexity of Ubuntu, not just as a catchphrase or an abstract idea, but something that is evolving, that we're living and practicing, and knowing that engaging Indigenous ways of knowing matters because it helps us approach today's interconnected challenges, especially at a time when our challenges are interconnected, but we ourselves are increasingly disconnected. And I think that's really important to have these spaces where we can come together. It's also important to look through at a critical lens through these at Ubuntu that helps us gain a deeper understanding. So I really appreciate everyone who brought that to the table. At the Alliance for African Partnership, conversations like this are at the heart of what we do. And I take up Upenu's invitation to having some more time to hold another event of this. We will talk about that and let's get something moving forward. I think we're quite open to that. AAP was created to build relationships rooted in equity and reciprocity and to uplift African knowledge, lived experience, and leadership. And so Ubuntu is not just something to talk about or study as we talked about today. It's a way of showing up in our partnerships, grounded in care, connection, and co-creation with institutions and with communities. So I hope that each one of us can take something forward from what we've heard and what we've done today in this session and carry it into our work, our relationships, and our communities. I look forward to future conversations like this. Again, I thank everyone for their contributions, and I know that I learned a lot today, and will be taking many things forward into my life and work. So thank you.